Celebrating 50 years of A&A. Conversations on the past, present, and future of self-determination.
Ha mitakiapi, emachiapi Patrice Kunesh. Hello, my relatives. I'm Patrice Kunesh. I'm the Commissioner of the Administration for Native Americans in the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. And we are here today to do an interview with one of my most favorite people and one of my real-life heroes, John Echohawk, the Executive Director of the Native American Rights Fund. The Administration for Native Americans is celebrating its 50th anniversary. This year, 50 years ago, Congress passed the Native American Programs Act, which really was all about creating opportunities through grant and funding to support the social and economic welfare and well-being of Native communities. John Echohawk was part of that era, and he has been running as the executive director, leading the Native American Rights Fund, a national litigation firm on behalf of Native Americans for these past 50 years as well. I actually started my law career under an A&A grant at the Native American Rights Fund. So I am extremely pleased and so honored to be able to interview John for this momentous occasion on our 50th anniversary and 50 years of Native advocacy across Indian country. Thank you, John, for being here today.
Thank you, Patrice, and I'm really glad to be invited and participate in this momentum occasion.
Oh, great. Well, a little bit about your history. You were the first Native student to graduate from the University of New Mexico Law School. How did that happen?
Well, I had wanted to be a lawyer, and for some reason I didn't know why, but I started there at the University of New Mexico, and they gave me a scholarship, which I needed because our family was poor, and I had a scholarship to go to college, so I needed one for law school. And at the University of New Mexico School of Law, they were asked by the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1967 to start providing scholarships for Native Americans to go to law school as part of the War on Poverty. They said one of the best things they could do to help Indians get out of poverty is to try to get some Indian professionals, because we had virtually no doctors and no lawyers, just a handful. And they thought that would really help our communities if they could get some professionals. So they started handing out scholarships administered by the law school there at UNM, and me and some other Native students started there at UNM, and other students, Native students, started at other law schools around the country at that time. And to the credit of that faculty there at the University of New Mexico Law School, they put together one of the first courses ever taught in federal Indian law.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know anything about it, and the other Native students, they didn't know either. And wow, we see we have all these rights under the treaties and Constitution and laws of this country, but they were going unenforced. And then we learned about the legal process, and that is basically, it doesn't matter what the law is, unless you have lawyers to enforce that law, then you don't have any rights. We were the poorest of the poor, and our people, our tribe, we had virtually no lawyers.
Right.
And so none of this was happening. Plus, we had this very bad federal Indian policy in effect at that time. We come to find out the policy of termination and forced assimilation of our people. They were ignoring the treaties and our rights to be Indians, and forcing us to move to the cities and do away with our tribes. And wow, it was wrong, and it was against the law, but nobody was enforcing the law.
Right. So I had the good fortune of going to law school as well under a scholarship, now through the Department of Education, to support Indian people going into law school. So I would not have been here either except for that opportunity. But you mentioned the opportunity through the Office of OEO, and that actually is the predecessor agency to ANA, the Administration for Native Americans, really coming out of that war on poverty. They found that Native communities, as you said, the poorest of the poor, were forgotten, left behind, ignored, trampled on the legal rights. So in 1974, Congress passes the Native American Programs Act. That was during an era what they call self-determination. So after assimilation and boarding schools and termination, now comes this new era of self-determination. And I think it actually stuck, and I think it actually has done a lot of good. But what is your recollection, John? What made self-determination different? And why did it come out of the 70s with such roaring power?
Well, the 1960s was really the era of civil rights enforcement, and of course that was primarily about equal rights for black people. And when they started asking our people, well, do you want equal rights as well? And our people started saying, well, not really. We want our treaty rights, doing away with this termination assimilation policy and giving us the right to self-determination. And then in 1970 it happened because President Richard Nixon changed the old policy of assimilation and termination to one of self-determination. He was the first president to do that. He had some experience with Indians, so he was familiar with these concepts, and he announced a new federal Indian policy in 1970. That was the same year that I graduated from law school and helped to start the Native American Rights Fund and started providing legal representation to our people as a nonprofit organization, raising money just like the civil rights people did. They had the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, nonprofit organization, hiring lawyers to represent black people. Well, we hired lawyers to represent our people, and away we went. And it really changed everything.
What does self-determination mean for those who don't understand federal Indian law? I know it to be about the rights of tribal nations to make their own laws, to be governed by their own laws, to be self-determined in who they are and in their culture and traditions. There's a legal component too, and I think it really was a shift from the heavy-handedness of the Bureau of Indian Affairs running everything, making all the decisions, to tribes being in charge.
Yes, that's what self-determination is really all about. The tribes are nations that's recognized in the U.S. Constitution, and there's 3 units of government in this country: the tribal governments, the state governments, and the federal government. And we'd been suppressed for so long that self-determination gave us that right to determine our own futures again. And that started in 1970, and it really changed everything as we started able to, make our own decisions and not be run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs anymore.
So my grandfather was born in 1902 on the Fort Berthold Reservation. And at that time, Indian people, Native people, were not considered citizens of the United States. They had no right to vote, no right to make contracts, own property. They had really no rights at all. You had mentioned that we had the civil rights era in the 60s, and then we had the treaty rights, coming through the 70s through the Native American Rights Fund. What do you think is the most important, most valuable right of tribes?
Well, it's that right of self-determination, which is the right to exercise their sovereignty as a tribal nation, as an independent government, and make their own decisions in the best interest of their people, regardless of what the federal government says. And that's our sovereign authority. That's self-determination.
And that right isn't granted to Native people, is it?
No, it's an inherent right as a sovereign nation that we've had since the beginning of time. Since the first contact in 1492, the European nations came to understand that there were tribal nations that had their own governments and made their own decisions, and all the conflicts that they had oftentimes were resolved through through treaties. And this 300 years of history found its way into the U.S. Constitution in 1787 when the Constitution recognized our tribes as tribal nations. And of course, that's continued ever since then with some interruptions of some bad federal Indian policies along the way, but eventually all that got corrected by the self-determination policy adopted in 1970. That's continued up to this day.
Continued to this day.
Yes.
It's really quite amazing to see that this is the only federal policy that has worked, that has stayed, and has really advanced Native people in governance, but socially, economically. One of the things we do through the Administration for Native Americans is support Native languages. We support cultural lifeways. We're really trying to see that anything that works and is successful in the communities always has that cultural element to it. So those treaties preserving rights to land and subsistence and water and so forth also are about protecting our cultural sovereignty too, right?
Yes, it sure is. And that's one of the priorities that the Native American leaders who serve on our board of directors set as one of our priorities, and that's protection of our human rights. And one of those important human rights is protection of our Native American religions and culture. And so we've always worked on those issues all these years.
So our work goes hand in hand in so many different ways. You, when I started at the Native American Rights Fund under an ANA grant to do Indian child welfare work, I had no idea of the importance and the value of ANA to NARF or to Indian country generally. I was working at that time to really understand the law, the regulations, how it was being applied in court. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit how ANA has impacted the work of NARF over the years, and how you, as an administrator and a leader of the largest law firm essentially advocating for Native rights, how ANA funding impacted the trajectory of NARP's work, both as an organization and in the community.
Well, as a nonprofit organization, we had to raise money from as many sources as we could to, hire legal staff and make them available to our tribes, organizations, individuals to represent them on the most important issues facing them. And unfortunately, philanthropy in this country didn't really understand Native American people, and it was very difficult to raise money to provide this legal representation to our Indian people. So funding sources just really very important to us. And, here comes ANA, that understands the social and economic needs of Native American people and starts providing big grants for us to do our work representing these tribes, organizations, important Indian rights issues. And they really carried the day for a long time as one of our largest funders and allowed us to represent, like I said, a lot of tribes and organizations and all these important issues that had been unaddressed for so long. And again, it's, part of the U.S. law, part of the Constitution, and, we were very successful in terms of bringing these cases forward and winning them and changing things on the ground socially and economically for the tribes.
I was reading your testimony to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii was the chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs at the time, and it was about the reauthorization of the Native American Programs Act, which funds the Administration for Native Americans. And in your testimony, you talked about how ANA supported NARF's work securing water rights, for example, on the Rocky Boy Reservation in Montana, or subsistence hunting for the Alaska Native people throughout Alaska, or I think it was land restoration for the Alabama Coushatta tribe in Texas.
Yes. Well, these are all important rights that our Native American tribes and people had that were not being recognized until we came along and provided legal representation to get those recognized. You know, the water rights issue is a big issue for tribes out west. You know, out west, you know, unless you have rights to water, you know, you're not going to be able to exist because it's a very scarce resource. And tribes, under the laws of this country, they have the senior rights to water. They get access to water. It's based on prior appropriation, who was there first, and whoever's there first, they get the water first, and that's us. But
we have to prove it, right?
That was going unrepresented. We had to prove that. That you know, okay, well, you know, here's all these users under state law that you know, got their rights after we did, and we just needed to bring that to court and get a court order saying they have the senior rights, these tribes. So we did that in a number of cases, including that one up there in Montana for the Rocky Boys, and up in Alaska. They really depend on hunting and fishing to make their living. That's called a subsistence right, and under the laws of the nation, rural residents in Alaska had the priority to hunt and fish. And most of those rural residents are Alaska natives. And so they really have the priority for subsistence hunting and fishing, but it was going unrecognized until we came along and started representing them and established that these Alaska natives, as rural water users, have this senior right, this preferential right for subsistence hunting and fishing, which is the way they live. And so it preserved their way of life. And then the recognition of the Alabama Coushatta tribe in Texas. There were just a number of tribes that came to us, including Alabama Coushatta, when we first opened the doors and said, you know, we're not recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs federal government as a tribe, but we've been around all this time. We have all these documents and things where, you know, we used to work with them, but now they say, no, you're not a tribe. And so, you know, we started going to Washington and showing them all these documents and talking to them, and finally they said, okay, but we had so many, they finally had to call time out and start a federal recognition process, an official process with regulations and everything to process all of these tribes that had gone unrecognized that should have been recognized, and Alabama Coushatta was one of those. And it just changed, you know, so many things for so many tribes that had gone unrecognized.
Well, I recently was in Alaska, and I did visit with several of our community partners. I do not call them grantees or recipients. I really consider them partners, because although we're providing the funding, they're the ones who are really doing the work and making the impact. And several of these community partners are continuing that kind of work, subsistence farming and hunting. And with climate change and so forth, it is even more dire that they understand what they can do and what the reaches are of their ability to continue that subsistence. And on the water rights, we now know that, especially around that Exxon Valdez oil spill many years ago, the marine habitat has not actually ever been restored. So there's continuing to monitor toxic algae bloom and trying to maintain that marine aquaculture as their subsistence right. And this is all through ANA grants. It's actually amazing to see the breadth of the projects going on throughout Indian country. And I consider like NARF leading the way to show us what can be done and how deeply and intensely the work, because it's not one and done. It's a long process, many years to accomplish some of these very basic but critical needs of the community.
Yes, it sure is. And, you know, the challenges continue. Subsistence hunting and fishing up in Alaska right now is being severely impacted by climate change, and it's really impacting the salmon runs, and it's a very big issue up in Alaska right now, trying to address those.
I'd say it's very dire,
issues.
very dire.
Yes,
So here we are, we're celebrating ANA's 50th anniversary. I know you've had a celebration recently for NARF's 50th. But as we imagine the next 50 years for ANA and for NARF as well, I think we definitely will continue trying to enhance the social economic conditions, governing capacities of tribal governments, tribal courts, and so forth. But how do you envision the next 50 years of federal-tribal relations?
Well, it really depends upon you know, the laws and policies of the United States government, and you know, they're basically set by the people that are elected into the Congress and into the White House, and you know, then the White House, you know, it brings on administrators, you know, the administrative branch, and you know, appoints people and things. So it really kind of comes down to the elections, and hopefully people who support Native rights are the ones who get elected and then make the appointments, and you know, do all of that. And it's a constant challenge, particularly right now. A lot of the work that the Native American Rights Fund is doing today relates to a protection of our voting rights and access to the polls, and to do away with these laws that try to suppress our vote, because some of the people in this country are not supportive of Native American rights and try to eliminate those or suppress those, and they're the ones who are, you know, passing these bad laws trying to keep us away. So we've got to do a lot of litigation to protect our voting rights, and enable people who support Native American rights to go to the polls and vote, and hopefully elect people who are going to support us in the Congress and in the White House and in the federal agencies. And so it's really a matter of politics. And like we've talked about, this Indian self-determination policy has been around now, what, 54 years, and hopefully that's going to continue. But as we've seen from Indian policies in the past, that can change, and we sure hope it doesn't change, because it's done really great wonders for us, allowing us to do our social and economic, you know, self-sufficiency, and but it all depends on the politics, and so we got to be involved in that.
Well, speaking of that, of sorts, President Biden last November at the Tribal Nations Summit announced this new executive order and launching a new era of tribal self-determination. And I think it's really a charge to the federal government to be mindful, maybe even more directed in saying, we need to change the way we fund services and programs to Native people. So for example, in ANA, we are a completely grant-making agency. We don't run services or programs, we give our monies away. But even in those grant processes, there's a lot of bureaucracies and burdens around reporting and so forth. And I think what I get from it is President Biden really challenging us as a federal government to cut those bureaucratic knots and allow tribes to use the funds in the way that they feel is best needed, the critical issues of the time. Do you see that that is also needed, and what could that really do if tribes were in control of the federal funds, you know, that are being used to support their communities?
I thought that was a great move by President Biden to do that, because one of the things I hear from tribes is it's really great that the Biden administration and the Congress has made all this new money available to the tribes, but tribes have capacity issues in terms of trying to access that money, and a lot of it relates to all these you know, bureaucratic processes that they have to go through to get those funds. And of course, the executive order really calls on all the agencies to streamline those procedures and processes to make it easier for tribes to access that money. And I think that's a great move. And I know about those kind of things because, of course, the Native American Rights Fund, we're a nonprofit organization, so we have to deal with all those kinds of issues too. So I know some of them are kind of complicated and burdensome, and boy, I like the ones that are short and simple and easy. And now,
Right.
you know, the federal government's going to make it all short and easy, and help fund Indian self-determination through these simplified processes.
Yeah. I hope so. In my agency, we've really revolutionized our grant process by cutting the application by 70%. We hope to fully fund our grants up front so that a project can get off the ground and get a good start and really make sure that it can fulfill the promises of the project. And on the back end, really easing the evaluation and reporting criteria. So I think we had the idea first, but we're living it and wanting to fulfill both the spirit as well as the letter of that executive order.
Yeah, I think it's a great development.
Yeah. There are a couple things I'm really curious, personally, John, aside from ANA, but this last year I was working with the Native American Rights Fund during the time of the Brackeen case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And NARF had a fantastic team briefing the case as an amicus to the Supreme Court. It was part of a national coalition. I think you had the largest number of tribes sign on to the amicus brief itself to uphold the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we were all holding our breaths at ACF and ANA, HHS-wide, of course, the rest of the government, to see what the Supreme Court would do with the Indian Child Welfare Act and the constitutional challenges to the law. Can you just give us a few of your reflections when the decision came out?
Well, we were really, of course, very excited and very happy, just like all of Indian country, about the decision in our favor 7-2. But we weren't really sure that was going to happen because of the way the Supreme Court has been ruling on federal Indian law issues in recent years. It, win some, lose some, and you just never knew. And so we were ready for whatever. We had been ready to try to talk about a loss if that's what happened. But again, fortunately, it did not happen, and we were overjoyed, just like Indian country, about that. But again, it depends on the U.S. Supreme Court, and over the years, based on the makeup of the court, then that can change sometimes, particularly when we started in the 70s and 80s. Most of these federal Indian law cases were winning cases, and an inordinate number of them being decided in our favor by the U.S. Supreme Court, since the issues had been neglected for so long. But then as the makeup of the court changed, starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, and became more and more difficult to win those cases. And it really, again, getting back to the point I made earlier, it really kind of depends on who gets elected and who gets to make the nominations and who gets to make the confirmations in the Senate. And that's all politics. And we need people in there who understand Indians and understand federal Indian law and policy and trust responsibility to be there for us. And it all depends on who's elected.
Well, that case kind of cut to the core of tribal sovereignty, really challenging tribes as tribal sovereign nations. It challenged the whole body of federal Indian law as race-based, impermissible race-based. And I thought the decision very solidly confirmed that tribes are sovereign nations, have a right to exist, and have government-to-government rights, and actually within the Constitution itself, and that Indian law, the laws made on behalf and for the benefit of, and oftentimes correcting all the wrongs of the federal government, are not race-based. They're actually based on, again, this sovereign status. How did that make you feel when the court gave that affirmation?
Well, it was a terrific affirmation again by that 7-2 majority. I mean, 7 justices. They recognized our right to self-determination, the power of Congress under the Constitution laws to recognize our sovereign status and to pass this law to help protect our Indian children. And it's not based upon race. It's not a racial classification. It's a nation-to-nation relationship that goes back from beginning of time. And it was, again, great to have 7 justices recognize that and affirm that.
I hope that's a settled question, right? I hope we're not doing this again in 5 years.
Right. You never know.
You never know. And my other curiosity is, we've been talking a lot lately about this incredible movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. And it takes place in Oklahoma, your state. You're a member of the Pawnee Nation. The movie doesn't get into all the history of the relationship between the state and the native people and the tribes there, but it's getting so much acclaim, and I think even Academy, attention and so forth. Well, have you seen the movie, and what did you think of the portrayal of the history? Did it do a good enough job? Is there more history to tell? What should we really take away from it?
Yes, I did see the movie, and I thought it was very well done. I thought it portrayed the history pretty well about one of the worst chapters of the treatment of Native people in this country, and I thought, like I said, they did a great job. I just wish they could have brought everything up to date, and what happened after that time. Basically that system they had of head rights ownership.
Incompetence.
Head right ownership, and it went down through families, and as a result of things like happened in the movie, then when the Osage get killed off, if they had white relatives, then the white relatives get the head rights, and basically the Osage Nation was run by head right owners. And so here we go into 2006, and there's a whole bunch of non-Indians with these head rights who are part of the Osage Nation government. And here's all these Osages that are not part of, don't have a head right, that are not part of the government. And that was wrong, and the Osage people came together and worked with the Congress to be able to modify their tribal constitution, to do away with the head right ownership running the tribal government. And the Osage people themselves, people with Osage blood, they became the tribal government.
Can you believe that we needed a law to do that, right?
Yeah. But we did it. We did it, and like I said, I wish that part of the story could have been told after the movie.
I agree. We know so much more oftentimes, and like this conversation, we're just scratching the surface, aren't we?
Yes. Right. So many issues out there, and we're always there to work on them when they come up, and just one challenge after another.
Well, John, I just want to say thank you so much for everything you've done these past 50 years.
Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
And thank A&A for supporting it for so long, helping us.
Absolutely. You're my hero. You truly are.
Thank you.
Great. So Wopila Tonka to John Echohawk for joining us today to hear a little bit about the history of the administration for Native Americans, our past 50 years, and maybe taking a peek at what the next 50 years would look like. Thank you.
Celebrating 50 years of A&A. Conversations on the past, present, and future of self-determination. Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.